We also see leaders today that think in a more analytical way. I said the world is more complicated and much more complex. And the leaders today understand how to dissect that world, how to analyze it and break it down, and then how to synthesize or construct it in a way that's useful. They're analytical thinkers. They can do that breaking down and that reconstructing. They're systems thinkers. They understand the issues and the problems they're dealing with and how they fit in the overall context of the environment they're in the system they're in the system of systems they're in. And they're creative thinkers. They think outside the box. 2 years ago, I was invited by General Odierno to go to Iraq to do an outside assessment of how things were going there. One of the things that struck me, maybe most significantly, is as I sat in his headquarters, I told him that in the morning briefings, I could close my eyes and not know I was in a military headquarters. They were briefing the results of the date palm harvest, the opening of recreational swimming pools, the management of the museums and zoos, the groups that were interacting with the tribes that were beginning the dialogue, the Center for Energy Fusion, making sure that the kilowatt hours of electricity were up. I didn't hear the 2 up and 1 back and the military stuff. That was all there, obviously, but the focus is on what would change this society. And I said to Ray Odierno, I said, this is amazing. I mean, the things that you're doing that are not military. And he smiled, and he said, Dave Petraeus, as he drove around, he knew what we had to do militarily, and we did it. I mean, the tactics were innovative after the surge and the way they operated. But he said, we're not going to turn this place around unless we prove to the people, the society, that life is better. And nobody else was doing it. And so those in uniform stepped up and did something totally out of their training, their education, even their mission sets, and got it done. Creative thinking. You also see in these leaders the capacity to make decisions based on that analysis, based on the way they have taken their experiences and built the ability to recognize patterns, trends, to see almost instinctively, intuitively, what needs to be done. They are, too, strategic thinkers. And if I have to say one thing tonight that I'd like you to take back, the greatest absence that I see in leadership today is this future orientation, the ability to think strategically, to understand where you want to take your organization in the future. We have become a society of here and now, day-to-day operations. We don't have the marshals that thought strategically, that could see an horizon that was going to be very different from the place they were standing, even though the place they were standing at the end of the Second World War had us on top of the heap, saw the challenges and the need to adapt, change, alter the conditions that would make life better. And I don't see it. I don't see it in business. I don't see it in government. I don't see that future orientation, that strategic thinking. Thanks to all the technology we have become communicators and information receivers. We don't process any of it. We don't develop it in a way that is going to get us somewhere. We don't think in terms of a strategic design. If you don't believe in me, look at that teenager that's on that cell phone that's twitting and tweeting and communicating and emailing and on the computer, receiving information. From where? From what blog? Is it accurate or not? A flood of information, a flood of communication. And in between, no brain cells working on what's coming in and what's going out. And that tends to be symbolic of our society. I see it in business all the time. They're living from day to day. They're living from quarter to quarter on a business report. And they're not looking forward. I would ask all of you in this room to tell me, what is the future strategy of the United States of America? What is our national security strategy? What is America's power and purpose? Where do we see ourselves in 10 years? How has that been articulated? What are we doing now to shape that? We have the residue of past doctrines and legacies. We are positioned around the world in something that reflects the end of World War II as opposed to the 21st century. We don't have a design. We don't have a future that actually takes into account a new world order. The leaders today are in charge of their organizations. They shape them, they mold them, they move them, and they're not afraid to alter them. Any organization that looks like a Christmas tree, block and wire diagram, is a dinosaur today. Look at our government, bloated bureaucracy, tiered, leveled beyond the ability to get anything done. Look at successful businesses that are streamlined, flattened, constantly changing and morphing, that calls themselves webs and networks, as opposed to these hard-lined, hard-wired, tiered, block and wire bureaucracies. Leaders today are not afraid to change organizations, not afraid to have multiple lines of communication, not afraid to engage the entire organization in decision-making and in learning. Where it isn't a top-down organization, it is flattened, it is interconnected, it shares, it participates. And I can give you all sorts of examples of companies that do this sort of thing and that aren't afraid. They tend to be younger. They tend to be not afraid of change and not afraid of experimentation. Leaders today understand the speed at which decisions have to be made, the impact of technology. We are wired, and our technology advances and changes relatively every year. They can master it, they can stay up to it, they don't let it run them, and they can keep up with the speed of decision-making, the speed of information, and can selectively pick what they need, and they can structure the way they receive information and how they process it. They aren't overwhelmed, they aren't constipated by it. They aren't slowed down. They don't lose the pace on competition. They also understand their environment. They're students of this world. They understand now, like every organization, that you no longer can live in an isolated small area. In one of my book tours, I was talking to a group of food distributors in the Midwest, and I talked to an individual who had just inherited the company from his father. And in the time his father owned the company, you could draw a circle around his entire world, suppliers, his distribution system, his customers. And that circle probably encompassed less than 3 states in the heart of the United States. He now was global. His suppliers were from all over the world. His customers were global. He had a website where you can order from his company, and that website was managed in Bangalore, India by some company. Suddenly, a drought in some part of the world, a political situation in another part of the world affected his business. His understanding of the world had exploded and expanded in its requirement to know what was happening. In virtually every part of society, that's become true. Think about how isolated we are. I tell my students, if you want to understand the world, read The Economist, listen to BBC, go online and read the English language newspapers from the different parts of the world. Because if you isolate yourself to worrying about the bowel movements of celebrities that we tend to put on our news media, that tends to dominate our information, you're going to realize there's a whole world out there that's churning and burning that's going to affect your life, that you have no knowledge of what's going on. We have become arrogant, and we lack the discipline to understand the interconnectivity and the dependency that's been created in this new world order. And so we're constantly surprised when some darn thing in the remotest part of the world affects us, our security, our livelihood, our well-being. But these leaders do. And the successful leaders today are good communicators. They don't lock themselves in that oak-paneled office on the top floor. They're the face of the organization. They're out in front in times of crisis and in the good times. They are the persona of the organization. They communicate internally and externally exceptionally well. And most important, they can lead an organization through crisis and change. I don't know of any organization today that has not or isn't on the verge of some crisis or some monumental change. And the impact of change and crisis is the same. And those that are superior leaders can get everybody through it. They understand what they have to do. They don't commiserate, they lead. They feel for their people, but they get them through it. They show that they will take them through the hard times. They will get them through the change. They will get them through the crisis of today. They don't begin to feel sorry for themselves. Leaders today that are successful make sure they know who they are. They spend time in understanding themselves. They block out that time, that creative time that they need. They ensure their lives are varied and whole. They have time for family. They have time for the company and the organization. They have time to do the things that help them develop and mean something to them, personally and professionally. And we have today, I think, a dire need for these kinds of leaders. It's interesting to be here at the Marshall Center because I can't think of any other American that epitomizes the things I've described. I was telling someone before we came in, my first real understanding of who George Marshall was came when I was a young officer and I attended a conference, military history, and I listened to the Army's chief historian describe why so many Army officers who before the war only could command very small units in the 17th largest army in the world, right behind Romania, that suddenly could be thrust into command of exceptionally large organizations, armies, field armies, corps, divisions, with technology that couldn't be imagined even years before, against a foe that had been long militarized, long steeped in military tradition and professionalism, and yet prevail. And almost every one of those leaders were traced back to George Marshall. Recognition of their leadership potential, put into his little book, personally mentoring and ensuring they developed, that they understood. What you didn't have the experience to command directly, he gave them vicariously. I think one of the greatest periods of our history that get little attention is that period after World War II, where we faced a world that was changing, and very few people realized it. It was a unique time in our history because we were about to embark on the Marshall Plan, unheard of before, where not the enemy was going to pay reparations, the victors were going to pick up the enemies and reconstruct them, where we developed a military alliance in NATO, unheard of. Washington and Jefferson had to be rolling over about these entangling alliances, creating the World Banks, restructuring government in the 1947 National Security Act, developing the National Security Council, doing all sorts of things that were unique, were revolutionary. And I will leave you with one thought as to why it was successful. The brilliance of Marshall, his apolitical nature, a Democratic administration, and a Republican Congress. Harry Truman, George Marshall, Arthur Vandenberg. Find them today. Find out where we can find these sorts of people that come from all ends of the spectrum that can meet and do what's best for the nation and think forward. To me, that's the challenge today. Thank you for coming out.